I designed the city's power monitoring system. Every substation, every meter, every load balance trigger. So when HOA Karen destroyed my backup batteries and bragged that no one needs off-grid power here, she didn't realize I could track her illegal salon's electricity use down to the second. And I didn't just track it. I engineered her downfall. I had no intention of making enemies when I moved into Maple Ridge Estate. I'd spent the last 10 years neck-deep in municipal infrastructure work, grids, backups, emergency systems. So when I finally bought a house in this picturesque, neatly trimmed neighborhood, I was looking for one thing: peace. Quiet, suburban peace with a bit of solar self-sufficiency and maybe, just maybe, a neighbor who'd talk to me about obscure battery chemistries over a barbecue. What I got instead was Karen. Not a Karen. The Karen. A woman who wielded her HOA title like a royal decree and who seemed to have memorized the entire community bylaw handbook just so she could weaponize it against anyone who dared to express personality. Gnomes were banned. Wind chimes were considered auditory pollution. Decorative rocks were inspected for size. I wish I was kidding. I met her officially on my third day, right after my solar panels went up and before my backup battery system was even fully installed. She marched across my driveway like it belonged to her, holding a clipboard like it was a legal document. Her first words to me weren't welcome or hello, they were, "Those panels will have to come down." When I asked why, she pointed to Clause 14.3 subsection B in the HOA rules about unauthorized external structures with reflective properties. I calmly told her the panels were approved by the city and invisible from the street. She blinked at me like I'd spoken Latin. Then she huffed something about aesthetics and walked off, muttering into her phone. That was our beginning. The truth is, I'd already done my homework. Maple Ridge Estates had a long and unfortunate history of HOA abuse under Karen's rule. Dozens of complaints about fines for arbitrary violations, citations for things like overgrown herbs, and forced removals of completely legal home improvements. But the neighborhood was beautiful, the price was right, and I'd built enough legal shields around my property that I thought I'd be safe. What I didn't expect was how petty and vindictive she could get. After my solar setup went live, she sent me 5 warning letters in 2 weeks. One said the battery boxes in my backyard weren't harmoniously integrated into the landscape. Another claimed the sound of the battery inverter was disturbing to birds. It was ridiculous, but I played nice. I took photos. I filed responses. I even hosted a battery education barbecue, where I explained to confused neighbors what my system actually did. Most of them thought it was cool. Karen didn't show up, but her car circled the block 3 times during the event. Then came the first power outage. It was early spring, one of those surprise storms that knocks down lines and floods basements. The grid failed for most of the block. My house? Still glowing, thanks to my batteries. I offered to run an extension cord to my elderly neighbor's fridge, and suddenly I became a local hero. People realized having a prepperish neighbor with backup power might not be such a bad thing. Karen, however, was fuming. She called an emergency HOA board meeting, without inviting me, and tried to pass a retroactive ban on visible battery structures. Fortunately, someone leaked the recording to me. She called me a tech bro anarchist with an ego problem. I laughed. That's when I knew she was going to escalate. And escalate she did. One afternoon, after a long shift debugging a substation software update, I came home to find my gate open. My security cameras had gone dark. And my batteries, my beautiful, custom-installed lithium iron phosphate array, were soaking wet, slashed, and clearly tampered with. Wires yanked, vent ports jammed with gravel, one of the outer casings even bashed in with what looked like a tire iron. $20,000 gone. No note. No explanation. Just silence and the faint smell of spite. I was furious. Not just because of the money, but because it was so blatant, so personal. I called the police, filed a report, and submitted what little camera footage I had before the feed went dark. But then I remembered something. During my barbecue event, I'd installed a solar-powered bird feeder with a small camera facing my backyard, not part of the main system. I pulled the SD card, and there she was, Karen, in broad daylight, hopping my fence like a middle-aged ninja, followed by her teenage son holding a toolbox. The footage showed them spending nearly 20 minutes sabotaging the battery system. I watched her kick one of the units like it owed her money. At one point, she held up a screwdriver and mimed stabbing it into the inverter box while her son laughed. They left casually, like they'd just delivered a pie to a neighbor. I stared at the footage in stunned silence. It was the kind of stupid that makes your brain reboot. I could have taken this to the police, sure. I could have pressed charges immediately. But I didn't. Because I had something better. Karen didn't know the extent of my work. She didn't know that 3 years ago, I was contracted by the city to design the smart grid monitoring system, the very infrastructure that tracked every watt used in this area, including the HOA building's usage. She didn't know that I could legally access non-personal grid data for commercial properties. She didn't know I'd embedded real-time analytics into the very monitoring nodes her clubhouse used. And I had noticed something strange. The HOA office, officially just a meeting room with basic lighting and a coffee machine, was pulling industrial-level power during the day. I thought it was a glitch until I reviewed the logs again. Hairdryer-level wattage, regularly. Heating spikes. Usage patterns consistent with a salon. A full-blown, unlicensed beauty salon being run out of Karen's garage, hidden under the radar, concealed as HOA activity. And the best part? I had every kilowatt-hour logged, complete with timestamp. She thought she'd destroyed my batteries. What she'd actually done was trip the circuit on her own downfall. And now I was about to flip the switch. The storm rolled in like a freight train, unexpected, loud, and thoroughly inconvenient for everyone except me. Rain hammered rooftops, wind shook the fences, and just as I sat down with a hot cup of coffee and a book I hadn't touched in months, the neighborhood went black. One by one, porch lights winked out. The soft hum of air conditioners vanished. But my house? It lit up like a Christmas display. The backup batteries kicked in instantly, running silently beneath the rain, doing exactly what they were designed to do. I didn't think much of it at the time. In fact, I made another cup of coffee, smiled at the irony, and went back to my book. But across the street, through the blur of storm-soaked windows, I could see a shadow standing on Karen's porch. She wasn't watching the storm. She was watching me. The next morning, the power came back to the grid, and the sun returned like nothing had happened. But something had changed. Karen wasn't just annoyed anymore. She was obsessed. While most neighbors came by to thank me for offering to share my power during the outage, Karen was conspicuously silent. No apology for trespassing. No acknowledgement of her actions. Instead, she doubled down. The very next day, I found a fresh HOA violation notice stuffed in my mailbox. Apparently, my backup system caused visual dissonance during emergency conditions. I had to reread it 3 times to make sure it wasn't a joke. A week later, I came home from work and knew something was off. It was subtle at first. My front gate, which I always locked, was unlatched. The side door to the backyard was slightly ajar. My heart began to beat faster as I rounded the corner of the house. And there it was. The battery system was wrecked. Cables ripped out, inverter box shattered, casing panels bent and dangling. One of the units looked like it had been hit with a crowbar. I felt my stomach drop. This wasn't random vandalism. This was deliberate. A message. I ran to check the security cameras, but the feed was dead. Someone had cut the line. Clean. Professional, almost. I called the police again, filed another report, and started cleaning up what I could, sick to my stomach. $20,000 worth of hardware ruined. Months of planning and installation undone by someone who didn't understand it and didn't care. I didn't have proof yet, but I didn't need a detective to tell me who was behind it. Karen wanted me out, and she was escalating. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, trying to decide what kind of war I wanted to wage. Legal? Civil? Tactical? All of the above? I was angry, sure. But more than that, I was focused. Because I hadn't told anyone, certainly not Karen, that I'd installed an independent, solar-powered bird feeder cam in my backyard. It was a project I'd thrown together for fun, a way to spot the occasional finch or squirrel. I didn't even remember it until I sat on the patio the next morning, staring at the wreckage, and saw the little lens poking from behind a wooden trellis. With shaking hands, I popped out the SD card and loaded the footage onto my laptop. It wasn't perfect, the rain had obscured parts of it, but then I saw them. Karen and her teenage son, creeping through the side gate like cartoon burglars. She was wearing gardening gloves and carried a screwdriver in one hand. Her son followed with a toolkit and what looked like a tire iron. They spent 22 minutes systematically destroying my batteries, laughing and pointing at the parts like they were disassembling IKEA furniture. I paused the footage at the frame where Karen smashes the inverter box with the tire iron. She looked pleased. Victorious. My hands trembled with a mix of fury and satisfaction. She had no idea what she'd just handed me. This wasn't petty vandalism. This was trespassing, property destruction, and a clear premeditated act caught on camera. I copied the footage in 3 places: cloud storage, USB, and an external drive. Then I got to work. What Karen didn't know was that my involvement in the city's power systems wasn't just technical. I had helped build the monitoring software used by the entire county. I had admin-level access to the logs of commercial properties, including the HOA's own clubhouse, which technically counted as a shared-use structure. I'd always suspected something weird was going on there. The power draw was inconsistent, high during weekday afternoons despite no scheduled meetings. And now that I had a reason to dig deeper, I did. The data didn't lie. There were regular spikes in power consumption every weekday between 1 p.m. and 5 p.m., blow-dryer levels of power. Curling irons, hot water draws, lighting clusters. And the logs matched exactly with the patterns of a small business. It didn't take a genius to figure it out. Karen was running a full salon out of the HOA clubhouse. Illegally. Unlicensed. Likely untaxed. And she was using HOA power to do it. Power paid for by the residents. The more I looked, the worse it got. She wasn't just stealing from the HOA. She was actively putting the neighborhood at risk by overloading circuits designed for light utility use. I didn't move immediately. I wanted her to feel secure, confident, smug. So I smiled when I saw her. I waved during our neighborhood walk. I even thanked her for her continued interest in my energy setup. Meanwhile, I was compiling a perfect package: video evidence of the battery destruction, full power usage reports from the HOA building, screenshots, graphs, timestamps. I even found Yelp reviews for her salon from years prior under a fake business name she never legally registered. She'd been doing this for a long time. I began reaching out to neighbors subtly. Casual chats, friendly small talk, gentle questions about whether anyone had received unexpected fines or odd HOA letters. The stories poured out like a dam had burst. One family had been fined for their son's sidewalk chalk. Another for planting tulips that didn't match the neighborhood's color palette. I was building an army without even asking for one. All it took was someone finally saying, "You too?" The next phase was quiet but satisfying. I contacted a zoning official I knew from a prior project. I explained that I had concerns about an illegal business operating in a residential area, and I had some data they might want to review. I didn't tell them who or where, not yet. I let the evidence speak for itself. Then I contacted my lawyer, sent over the footage, and asked him to prepare a civil suit for property damage. If she wanted a war, she was about to get a multi-pronged assault. Karen thought she'd won. She strutted around like the villain at the end of Act 2 in a movie, convinced the hero had been defeated. What she didn't realize was that I had just flipped a switch. And once it was on, there was no turning it off. Karen was many things, but subtle wasn't one of them. After destroying my battery array, she strutted around the neighborhood like she had just slain a dragon. The day after the sabotage, she hosted a little garden party, exclusively for her closest HOA allies, of course. They gathered in matching folding chairs under a canopy printed with the HOA logo, sipping cucumber water and talking loudly about standards and compliance. I passed by on my way to the mailbox, gave a polite nod, and she gave me a smile so smug I could have bottled it and sold it as face cream. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was patient, very patient, because while she was busy bragging, I was watching the data pour in, gigabyte by gigabyte, from the monitoring systems she didn't even know I had access to. Her little salon operation was in full swing that week. According to the logs, the power usage in the HOA building skyrocketed during the afternoons, beyond what could be reasonably explained by meetings or admin work. The data showed a clear pattern. Blow dryers ramping up around 1 p.m., heating elements for curling irons peaking around 2:30, and everything shutting down around 5. She was likely running appointments every 30 minutes, sneaking clients in through the back, and using the HOA clubhouse like her own private salon. And the kicker? All of that power was being drawn from the communal meter, billed to the neighborhood fund. I kept collecting data while simultaneously assembling a portfolio that would make any zoning enforcement officer drool. Charts, graph, thermal signatures, even timestamps showing when the clubhouse door opened and closed, courtesy of the HOA's own security logs. Logs that I had remote access to thanks to a firmware patch I'd helped install months before during a system upgrade. Every piece of evidence I needed was already there. All I had to do was organize it. I gave it a week. Let her feel untouchable. Let her gossip, intimidate, fine people for nonsense like non-compliant mailbox flags. Then I made my first quiet move. It started with an anonymous blog. I spun up a simple WordPress site, clean, minimalist, no names, just stories. HOA horror files, tales from the HOA trenches. I posted anonymized versions of real resident complaints, submitted via an untraceable Google form. I included my own story. No address, no names, just a tale of someone whose backup power system was destroyed by a petty neighbor with too much authority. The stories rolled in faster than I expected. People had been waiting for an outlet, fined for birthday decorations, harassed over invisible fence wiring, threatened for parking slightly outside the lines. Within a week, the blog had over 200 local hits, and word began to spread. Karen tried to ignore it. Then she tried to discredit it. She even accused the Smiths, quiet retirees with 2 rescue dogs, of running it. She was spiraling, and it was glorious. Meanwhile, I'd already submitted the zoning complaint. The city responded quickly. I knew the right people, and more importantly, I knew how to speak their language. Regulatory language. They flagged the HOA clubhouse for inspection under suspicion of unauthorized commercial use. I didn't attach my name to the complaint, but I did include enough evidence to make their heads spin. Power draw charts, audio logs of hair dryers, Yelp screenshots from Karen's pseudonym, offering appointments by referral only. The inspection was scheduled quietly, with no advance notice. Karen didn't know what hit her. But before that bomb could drop, I had one more card to play. The spring gala. It was Karen's favorite event of the year. A pastel-splashed afternoon of tea sandwiches, HOA awards, speeches, and mandatory attendance for any homeowner who didn't want a passive-aggressive fine the next week. This year's gala was special. Karen had rented a tent, hired a violinist, and printed programs with her own face on them, under the title President for Life? Complete with a question mark that absolutely wasn't a question. I RSVP'd with a smile. And I showed up early. You see, the HOA building's power had to pass through a breaker box. A box I knew intimately, because I had designed it. And while I wouldn't touch it myself, because, unlike Karen, I follow the law. I'd quietly tipped off the city inspector to check the unauthorized modifications I'd discovered through thermal scans. The inspector was already there that morning, going through everything. I just stood nearby, drinking weak lemonade, watching it all unfold. About halfway through Karen's opening speech, just as she was thanking herself for her years of unwavering leadership, the power cut out. Completely. The microphone died. The fans shut down. The violinist awkwardly plucked a few strings before giving up. Karen blinked into the silence like someone had just pulled the ground out from under her. She looked to the clubhouse, then to the breaker box, then to me. I smiled and gave her a polite shrug, sipping my lemonade like it was champagne. People whispered. The gala fizzled out. And then, just as the murmurs of confusion were beginning to swell into complaints, a city vehicle pulled up. 2 inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand. They asked to speak to the HOA president. Karen, now visibly sweating, tried to deflect. "This is a private event," she hissed. They informed her they had legal authority to investigate unauthorized commercial operations and potential misappropriation of communal fund. It was the beginning of her unraveling. As the inspectors toured the clubhouse, neighbors started asking questions. Why was there a full sink installed in the back room? Why was there a hidden shelf full of hair products? Why did the electricity bills spike every month even when there were no events scheduled? Karen stumbled through excuses, her words brittle and panicked. The violinist quietly packed up and left. A few neighbors pulled out phones and began recording. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The data was talking. The timing was perfect. The very next day, Karen sent out a mass email claiming she was taking a brief leave of absence for personal reflection. She didn't mention the inspection. She didn't mention the fact that zoning had already issued a notice of violation. She certainly didn't mention that a civil suit was now pending against her for the destruction of private property, bolstered by high-definition footage and multiple corroborating witness statements. But the neighborhood knew. And now, instead of fearing Karen, they were questioning her. Organizing. Whispering in driveways. Discussing whether maybe it was time for new leadership, someone less inclined to fine people for planting succulents. The tide was turning, and for the first time, Karen couldn't stop it with a form letter or a threat. She had crossed a line, and I had simply followed the wires back to her fuse box of lies. She thought she held all the power. But the thing about power is, if you don't understand it, if you don't respect it, it's only a matter of time before it shocks you back. Karen did not take humiliation well. After the spring gala disaster and the zoning inspection fiasco, she vanished for exactly 2 days. No HOA emails, no veiled threats, no sudden citations for non-existent violations. It was eerily quiet, like the calm before a particularly smug storm. I knew she wasn't done. I knew the moment she retreated, she was regrouping. And just as predicted, on the 3rd day, my doorbell rang at 6:42 a.m. I opened it in my robe, coffee in hand, only to find 2 uniformed officers standing on my porch with stern faces and clipboards. One of them asked if I was the homeowner. The other asked if I'd be willing to answer a few questions regarding a criminal complaint. I didn't need to ask who filed it. Karen had accused me of hacking. Specifically, she claimed I had unlawfully accessed the HOA's private systems, manipulated the clubhouse power grid, and intentionally disrupted a community event as a form of revenge. According to her, I was a tech criminal with a grudge and a dangerous obsession with power, both literal and figurative. She even mentioned my work on the city's infrastructure, as if that made me more suspicious. The officers weren't hostile, just doing their jobs, and I invited them in without hesitation. What Karen didn't understand was that every inch of what I'd done had been legal, documented, and approved. I'd never accessed anything without authorization. The systems I used were either public or under contracts I had helped write. I handed them a neat folder with timestamps, data logs, emails, and the HOA board's own signed agreement from 2 years ago, giving me administrator privileges over their monitoring tech. By the time the officers left, they were apologetic. I could tell they knew the complaint was weak. Karen had built it on emotion, not evidence. Still, it was annoying. She was trying to play defense by going on offense, but in doing so, she had just given me another weapon. Filing a false police report was a crime, and now that it was tied to an ongoing civil suit, it opened the door to a potential countersuit for harassment and defamation. I made a few phone calls. My lawyer was already excited. Karen had walked into another trap, and all I had to do was stand still. But she didn't stop there. She went full scorched earth. She sent a community-wide email titled, "Protecting Our Neighborhood from Cyber Intrusions," warning residents about individuals with technical knowledge who may misuse their skills to destabilize our peaceful community. She never named me, of course, but everyone knew who she meant. The irony was rich. The woman who had run an illegal salon in a public building was now trying to paint me as the villain for using the very tools I'd created, legally, to expose her. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The court date was already on the calendar. The small claims court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon. It wasn't criminal court yet, but it was enough. I arrived early, dressed neatly, with my evidence binders in hand. Karen walked in 20 minutes late, wearing sunglasses indoors, a dramatic scarf, and an attitude that could curdle milk. She brought her son as a witness, likely the same one who'd helped her destroy my backup system. As we sat waiting for the judge, she glanced at me and smirked. That smirk didn't last long. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience, asked me to present my case first. I walked through everything. The battery system, the sabotage, the lost footage, and finally, the discovery of the bird feeder camera. I played the video. The courtroom was silent as Karen and her son appeared on screen, hopping the fence like wannabe burglars. The judge leaned forward. I paused the video at the frame where Karen kicked the inverter box. Then I submitted the repair bills, the receipts, the zoning complaints, and the HOA system logs. The judge asked if I had any witness testimony. I handed her notarized statements from 3 neighbors who had seen Karen on my property that day and had heard her bragging afterward. Karen began to squirm. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a theatrical monologue. She claimed the batteries were leaking chemicals and posed a danger to children. She said she was protecting the community and didn't remember ever stepping onto my property. She insisted the video was doctored. Then, in a stunning moment of bad judgment, she tried to blame her son entirely, saying she didn't know what he was doing and had just gone along to make sure he was safe. Her son's face went pale. The judge narrowed her eyes. She asked him a direct question. Had he been told to destroy the batteries? The kid hesitated for 3 seconds too long. Then he broke. He admitted everything. Said it was his mom's idea. Said she'd told him it was the only way to stop that guy from taking over the neighborhood. His voice cracked halfway through, and the room fell dead silent. Karen stared at him like he'd turned into a stranger. The judgment was swift. Karen was ordered to pay for the damages in full, plus court fees. The judge made a formal note of her conduct and suggested that any further complaints be escalated to criminal court. Karen didn't even look at me as she left the courtroom, muttering something under her breath and dragging her son behind her like a broken kite. But that wasn't the end. Word traveled fast. Court transcripts were public. Neighbors began sharing links. Someone even made a meme of Karen kicking the inverter with the caption, "HOA stands for hysterically out of authority." Within a week, a group of residents called for a vote to remove Karen as HOA president. The meeting was packed. People who hadn't shown up in years were suddenly interested in governance. Karen tried to defend herself, claimed it was all a smear campaign. But the footage, the court judgment, and the now-confirmed salon operation left her with no ground to stand on. The vote wasn't even close. She was stripped of her presidency by a landslide. Her keycard was deactivated. her nameplate removed from the HOA office, and in a poetic twist, her replacement was the same neighbor she once fined for having a decorative flamingo in their yard. The first order of business under the new leadership? Approving new community rules that protected solar installations, personal energy systems, and digital transparency. Karen retreated into silence. Her house was still there, but she stopped making appearances. The salon signs disappeared. Her car was parked more often in the garage than the driveway. The HOA meetings felt lighter. People laughed again. Joked. Planned actual community improvements instead of bickering over bush height. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The damage was done, the balance restored. Karen had underestimated me because she thought power meant control. But I understood something she never would. Real power doesn't come from authority, it comes from knowing how the system works. And when someone abuses the system, well, I know exactly where to pull the plug. In the weeks following Karen's downfall, the neighborhood transformed in a way I didn't think was possible. Maple Ridge Estates had always looked like a postcard, manicured lawns, white picket fences, coordinated shutters, but now it finally started to feel like a real community. People waved again. Kids chalked on sidewalks without fearing citations. Neighbors who had never spoken more than 2 words to each other before were now hosting weekend cookouts. And somehow, without anyone officially declaring it, I had become the unofficial tech whisperer of the block. After the lawsuit payout, I immediately set to rebuilding my backup battery system. This time, I went bigger, smarter, and more discreet. The new setup was buried in a reinforced underground vault, covered by decorative gravel and surrounded by flower bed. Karen could try to attack it again, but she'd need a backhoe and a week's worth of permits. I also upgraded my home security, not just for protection but for pettiness. Motion-activated floodlights, invisible perimeter alarms, even an AI-powered doorbell that used facial recognition. If Karen or her son so much as blinked in my direction, I'd get a full 360-degree scan and a timestamp before they could even knock. But I wasn't just upgrading for me. I started helping others too. Quietly, no charge. I set up solar panels for 3 of my neighbors, discrete battery storage for 2 others, and created a guide that helped everyone understand how to apply for city grants for energy-efficient upgrade. The same system that Karen tried to use to control people, I was now using to empower them. And the irony didn't go unnoticed. One neighbor called it revenge by illumination. I liked that. Karen, meanwhile, was a ghost. Her house was silent most days, her lawn starting to brown at the edges. Without her HOA power, she had no reason to patrol the streets or police shrub symmetry. She no longer sent HOA-wide emails, no longer issued random fines, and certainly didn't have the nerve to show up to the new board meetings. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of her through a window, peeking out like a villain in a cheap sitcom. But she never stepped foot near me again. Not after the court case. Not after the vote. Not after everything. Then came the for sale sign. It popped up overnight, staked into her front lawn at a slant, as if even the sign had given up. The listing appeared online 2 days later, and it didn't take long for whispers to start circulating. Some said she was moving to Florida to be closer to family. Others claimed she was relocating to a neighborhood without an HOA. Though, given her personality, I doubted that. Karen without rules was like a shark without water. Still, no one stopped her. No one protested. Her exodus was treated like the quiet ending of a long, awkward sitcom arc fitting. But just when I thought the story was finished, it twisted one last time. About 3 months after she moved out, I was hired to do a systems upgrade in a suburban development about 20 miles away. They needed help modernizing their energy grid, integrating solar with smart monitoring, and building a secure data interface for residents. It was a clean project, good people, decent budget. On my second visit, I stopped by the main office to check on the power meters, and as I was leaving, I noticed someone arguing with a delivery guy near the entrance. Her voice hit me first, sharp, cutting, unmistakable. I turned, and there she was. Karen. Different haircut, different sunglasses, but the same stance, same clipboard, same snarl. She was berating the poor delivery driver over a package that had been left 3 inches outside the designated drop zone. I stood there for a second, stunned by the sheer audacity of her presence. She hadn't changed. She'd just found a new pawn to rule. She didn't see me. I slipped away quietly, laughing to myself all the way back to the truck. Of course she'd found another HOA. Of course she'd wiggled into a new position of imagined authority. People like Karen didn't retire. They relocated, replanted, and resumed their reign of beige tyranny. But this time, she wouldn't be so lucky. Because I had just been contracted to install the new monitoring system for her entire development. Which meant, without even realizing it, she had just handed me the keys to her next kingdom. I didn't do anything immediately. I didn't need to. I set up the infrastructure exactly as requested, clean, efficient, transparent. But this time, I built in some public dashboards, visible to every resident. Energy usage, system alerts, historical data. Every watt accounted for. No way to hide a salon operation in this setup. No chance to exploit the power grid for personal gain. If she tried even half the stunts she pulled before, the system would flag it and notify the board automatically. I left the job site that day with a kind of quiet satisfaction that didn't need applause. I hadn't followed her. I hadn't sabotaged her. I had simply done my job well enough that, if she tried to cheat the system again, the system would catch her without me lifting a finger. It was the most elegant kind of revenge. Baked into the structure, woven into the wires. Passive, permanent justice. Back in Maple Ridge Estates, things only got better. The new HOA president was relaxed but firm, focused on community improvement instead of control. We started a neighborhood garden. Kids chalked freely. Someone even built a tiny library box near the park. No one cared if the shutters didn't match. We had finally shaken off the tyranny of one person's obsession with perfection, and what emerged was something real, something kind. I never told the neighbors about my final run-in with Karen. They didn't need to know. That part of the story was mine alone, like an epilogue written in small font after the credits roll. What mattered was that we'd made it out. We'd won. Not by fighting her directly, not by screaming or stooping to her level, but by knowing the system better than she did and using it to expose the truth. People think power is about dominance, control, enforcement, but real power, the kind that lasts, is quiet. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. It's in the systems you build to protect the people around you. It's in knowing that justice doesn't always need a spotlight to shine. Sometimes it just needs a circuit. And if Karen ever decides to move again, to set up shop in yet another unsuspecting community, I hope she remembers one thing. The grid is everywhere now. And some of us still know how to read it.